When Gary first saw her photograph online, he couldn't look away. She was fair-skinned, with long black hair and deep, seemingly endless eyes. Her name was Alaya, and she lived far away in Yakutia, where winters were long and cold, and people were mysterious. Gary was from sunny California, where he knew nothing of real love, but when he began communicating with Alaya, his life changed. Her kindness and sincerity captivated him. She spoke of snowy expanses and the northern lights, of how her grandmother taught her fortune-telling with coffee grounds, and how they picked berries together in the summer. They exchanged messages for days and nights, and Gary felt like he had found his soulmate despite the thousands of miles between them. After a few months, Gary couldn't resist and bought a ticket to Yakutia. Their meeting was magical. Alaya was even more beautiful in person. Her laughter rang like a bell, and Gary's heart skipped a beat at her touch. They spent a lot of time together, walking the snow-covered streets of Yakutsk and enjoying each other's warmth. But one thing troubled Gary. Alaya often went to the village of Magaras, saying she needed to visit her family. She never went into detail about what exactly she did there, and it began to gnaw at Gary. He tried not to think about it, but jealousy and suspicion gnawed at him from within. He was afraid she might have someone else. One day, when Alaya was again preparing to go to Magaras, Gary decided to follow her. He rented a car and drove after her, trying not to catch her eye. The road led him through deserted, snow-covered forests and fields, and the further he went, the more he felt the growing cold and fear. Magaras turned out to be a tiny, almost abandoned village. He found the house where Alaya was staying and decided to wait until dark. At night, he emerged from hiding, and hiding in the shadows, began to follow her. He saw Alaya leave the house and head for the forest. Gary followed her, his heart pounding with excitement and fear. The forest was dark and gloomy. Gary followed Alaya until he saw a faint light ahead. He approached closer and saw a strange ritual people in black clothes stood around a fire, and in the center of the circle lay something terrible. It was a gruesome ritual, blood flowing in the snow, and Gary realized that Alaya was part of a sect engaged in gruesome rituals in praise of some ancient gods. He was filled with horror, but he couldn't look away. Suddenly, he realized that one of the sect members was looking right at him. It was a moment of panic. Gary recoiled, pursued by them, but managed to escape into the forest. He ran, not stopping until he reached the car and sped back to the city. Returning to Yakutsk, he tried to forget what he had seen, but it was impossible. Alaya returned and suspected nothing. Gary tried to act as usual, but fear and disgust for her never left him. He realized that his love had turned into a nightmare. Alaya returned home as if nothing had happened. She entered the apartment with her usual ease, her voice still soft and friendly, but Gary could no longer see her in the same light. He tried to hide his anxiety, but every glance from her, every touch reminded him of the horrifying ritual he had witnessed in Magaras. In the first days after her return, Gary couldn't shake the feeling that she knew about his stalking but skillfully concealed it. She was too calm, too self-assured. Gary felt like he was in a cage, locked in a house with a woman he could no longer love. The oddities began almost immediately. At night, he heard whispers coming from empty rooms. At first, he thought it was his imagination, but soon the sounds became clearer. It seemed to him that the whispers were speaking in an unfamiliar language, perhaps in the ancient Yakut dialect that Alaya had told him about. One night, he woke up feeling cold and discovered that all the windows in the apartment were wide open, although he remembered closing them before going to bed. Another time, he found strange symbols drawn in blood on the kitchen table. Alaya claimed not to know where they came from, and looked at Gary with such genuine concern that he began to doubt his own sanity. Gary decided to run away. He planned his escape carefully, hoping to leave early in the morning while Alaya was still asleep. But as soon as he tried to leave the house with his suitcase, he was suddenly seized by a sharp pain in his chest and fell to the floor, convulsing. Alaya found him, and, worriedly taking care of him, said it was just a heart attack. When Gary recovered, he tried again. This time he decided to leave late at night. He stealthily took the car out of the garage, but as soon as he hit the road, the brakes failed. The car went out of control and crashed into a tree. Gary miraculously survived, but was forced to return home with a broken arm. Every attempt to escape ended in failure. One night, as he made his way to the exit, he felt a strange dizziness and lost consciousness. He woke up at home next to a worried Alaya, who assured him that he was just overworked. One night, when Gary was lying in bed, he heard Alaya whispering something in the darkness. He listened and realized that she was repeating the same words he had heard in the forest. His heart stopped. He could no longer wait. Gary decided to try one last time, no matter what. He didn't know if he would succeed in escaping or not. But one thought consumed him: he must break free, even if it cost him his life. That night he prepared for another escape, realizing that he might not come back. And when he opened the door, there stood Alaya, her face devoid of expression, her eyes empty. "You can't leave," she said coldly. "You are a part of us now." Gary didn't know what she meant exactly, but his will to escape was stronger than his fear. He darted past her, ran out of the house, and fled without looking back. He didn't know how long he ran, but finally darkness overtook him. Gary woke up in the hospital, covered in bandages. The hospital room was dimly lit, and the silence was interrupted only by the faint hum of medical equipment. Gary lay on the bed, his body covered in bites and cuts. A doctor, an elderly man with piercing eyes, entered the room and sat beside his bed. "Gary," he began, "you probably don't remember how you ended up here. Let me tell you a very strange story." Gary, still weak and exhausted, nodded, ready to hear what he was about to learn. "We received a call to the emergency services at around 3 in the morning," the doctor started. The call was anonymous. The voice on the other end of the line was strangely distorted and spoke with an accent I couldn't quite place. They informed us that there was a man lying on the road leading from Yakutia towards Magaras, in need of urgent help. Gary tensed, remembering the moment when he ran, not looking back. What was strange, the doctor continued, was that the call was very precise. They provided the exact coordinates of your location. And what's even stranger, within a 300-kilometer radius of that point, there are no inhabited places, only forest and road. At first, we didn't believe it, but we decided to send a car to check. The doctor paused, as if considering whether to continue. Gary waited impatiently, his heart beginning to beat faster. When our team arrived at the specified location, they did indeed find you. You were lying on the roadside in the snow, unconscious. But the strangest thing happened later, when they returned to base and tried to trace the number from which the call was made for investigation. It turned out that this number did not exist. It was just a set of digits not tied to any of the operators. Gary felt a cold sweat running down his back. "What does this mean?" he whispered. The doctor shook his head. "We don't know. This is one of those unexplained cases that sometimes happen. But there's something else. One of our medics, who was on duty that night, said that when they were moving you into the car, he heard whispering coming from you. But you were unconscious.